Hi, I'm Seb and I make stuff, and this week we're going to be crafting with crystals. I'll be showing you guys how I made this display base for the crystal trees that I grew last week. I showed the basic bits in the last video, but this week I'm going to show you how I'm using a whole heap of elements from old videos of mine to put this piece together. In addition to that, I've also done a second display base, this one more of a scatter terrain piece for a mine or underdark. It can also be used as a display for a model, but I think I'm just going to keep it as a piece of scatter terrain. All of these are using these same borax crystals that I showed you guys how to grow in the last video, and I think these crystals are going to become a regular part of my terrain builds going forward, as I have a whole heap of underdark and crystal mine ideas. These borax crystals are quite simple to make, as shown in my previous video. All you need is borax, pipe cleaners, some hot water, and something to bring the whole thing to a boil. I'm also going to be using some pre-made plaster rock molds as shown in a lot of my older builds, and I'll be combining these using a homemade Sculptamold. The recipe is available here. Once that's mixed up nicely with some water and glue, I'm just going to dump it down onto these display bases that I've printed out that will fit perfectly into a display jar later on. These bases are available for free on Thingiverse if you'd like to print some out, and can also fit a tea light candle. Now I'm going to start adding in some of these plaster rock molds to give us some nice boulders sticking out of the earth, before bringing in some of that crystal and just shoving it into the Sculptamold, using this extra putty to hold everything in place, and once it dries, it will dry rock solid. I experiment with a few different pieces of crystal in different areas, again using the homemade modeling compound to squeeze up against the edges and really hold everything in place. And once you're happy with the formation, it's time to let it dry.
A few moments later.
Now that's dry, I mix up some water with some cheap brown acrylic paint. This works as a nice wash that soaks in nicely to the modeling compound. Just do your best to avoid getting this on the main areas of the crystal, as we want this to really shine through on the final build. Then we repeat the process on our other build and leave them to dry.
5 minutes later.
Time to bust out the contrast Space Wolves Grey. If you've seen any of my old videos like this, you know that I love using this contrast paint over top of these plaster rock molds. With the already brown wash underneath, I find that this dries in a beautiful matte stone finish that I really love for my pieces. And now that the stone's done, it's time to add some colour to these crystals. So we're going to be grabbing out some Game Ink by Vallejo and really dousing these guys in some bright coloured glossy inks. And once all of our crystals were hit with some colour, it was time to bring in another dirt layer. So I grabbed a Tamiya Soil Effects and piled it on everywhere that I wanted to look like bare earth, making sure to avoid the crystals and major stone pieces that I'd already spent time painting, but using this to help blend them all together. Then while this was still wet, I added some more stone and dirt to help add some natural variation to the colour, and left it to dry.
12 o'clock midnight.
I should be sleeping, but I want to glue down some bits and pieces and allow them to dry by the morning so I can keep working on these. So I grab the Mod Podge and start painting on some areas that I want to add some more detail. The first thing I'm going to use to add some variation are these tiny stones and dirt that I've collected, before coming in with some various phlox and grasses to add a nice natural green element. And once that's all stuck down, we're going to come over top with another layer of this dirt and rock to fill in all of the gaps of glue. And for this second base, I'm not going to add any of the greenery, I'm just going to add a heap of different dirts and stones to add some more variation, as I want this to be more of an underdark mine base rather than something out in the nature. And as our final step, we are going to soak everything with a watered down Mod Podge before spraying it all with an isopropyl alcohol to help break it all down. This just acts as a final sealant layer that will hold all of these bits and pieces together and stop it falling apart on our tabletop.
The following day.
Alright, so now we're going to take one of these trees that I built last week and hot glue it down to the base. These trees were the inspiration for these crystals and the main reason that this build is happening at all. I encourage you guys to check out that video as it's one of the coolest things I've ever made. And now that this guy is stuck down nicely, we're going to go around with the hot glue gun and make sure that all of these roots are stuck to our base like they're growing into the earth. Don't worry about any excess glue that shows through as we're going to cover this all up. Now that the tree's stuck down nicely, it's time to grab out that same brown acrylic paint we used earlier in the wash and cover up all of this obvious glue. By using the same brown base that we used on the tree and then blending it in with some stone and rocks, we can really blend this whole thing into the base nicely. And now to bust out the matte Mod Podge and really squeeze that into all of these areas that you want extra cover. We're going to now douse this with some static grass and more phlox to again blend all this into a nice natural overgrown look. Just doing our best not to cover up any of the major details that we want to display, like the stones and crystals. In this particular case, I thought there's no such thing as going overboard because I really do love an overgrown piece of terrain. Especially perfect for my Feywild environment, and a bit of fun to go really crazy since my other base is going to have almost no life at all. And once we're done with the basic flocking, it's time to start adding some grass tufts and flowers. This is what really helps these bases explode to life, and it's one of my favorite parts of any build. And while that looks pretty good as is, it's not quite one of my builds without adding a whole heap of mushrooms and little critters. So it's time to jump over to the Resin 3D printer and get a few more of those ready to go. All of these tiny bits are available for free on Thingiverse and the link will be in the description. Once you've painted them up with some nice bright colours, it's time to start supergluing them down all over your build. Anywhere that you think a bit of nature may have built up, or that you just think looks cool. After all, what is nature if not a giant mess of randomness? And I'll throw a few more details on these mushrooms to make them pop. And finally, we're going to throw down a few more inks on the top of this tree to make the whole thing explode with colour. And now it's ready to sit nicely in its display jar, as a part of my cabinet of curiosities, but also something that I can pull out for any game day and use as terrain. Most of the different methods used in this video have come from old videos of mine, so you might have seen some repeats. But it's great to take all these different elements and bring them together into one new piece. This crystal tree is going to make an awesome addition to my cabinet of curiosities, and additionally I have that extra piece that I can use as scatter terrain, or I can bring that back as a display base for a miniature. I've said it a few times now, but I think these crystals are going to become a regular part of my crafting from now on. So, if you guys have any cool ideas for how I could use them, let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, expect to see some Underdark terrain and crystal mine builds in the coming future. Until then, never stop making stuff.